Hello, my name is Jason, and I'm the administrator and co-founder of a site called TruthAlliance.net that operates out of Colorado. I'm also a representative of the local chapter of We Are Change here in Colorado called wearechangecolorado.org. Today we're going to be interviewing Dr. David Ray Griffin on the topic of globalism. On behalf of these organizations, we'd first like to just thank you for all the legwork that you've done for 9/11 Truth. We really have a leg to kind of stand on as a result of some of your work and some of the other folks and researchers out there. So just the truth community applauds you for that. And so today we're going to be talking about global government and what that means for the future of America and also the future of the world. And I'm just going to get some thoughts. So we'll just kind of dig right on in here. The first question, if I just gave you a palette and a paintbrush, kind of describe to us or paint us a picture of what the ideal form of global government might look like.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me say a word about how I got started on this.
Yeah, please.
I've been working on the nuclear issue for a long time, through the 80s, and trying to figure out some way that we could get rid of nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. And worked for several years on this, so flirted with issues of nuclear pacifism, and I realized, well, that wouldn't work. Apart from full pacifism, well, that wouldn't work. And I was approaching it as a theologian, so I was working with people such as Reinhold Niebuhr and people who had at one time endorsed the idea of some sort of global authority to solve the war problem, but then gave up on it. And so I was working on what I was then calling an anti-nuclear theology or post-nuclear theology. And finally I had several chapters written, but I couldn't find a solution, so I just put it in the drawer and started working on other things.
One of those cross your fingers things, huh?
Yeah, but then in 1992, I came across this concept of global democracy, in which the idea would be, and some people call it legal pacifism. So what it means is that rather than countries solving their disputes by going to war, they would go to court. So there would be a world court with mandatory jurisdiction to deal with problems such as now we're going to have huge disputes about water usage in various parts of the world that are going to lead to war. And increasingly we're going to have resource wars, as we're now having over oil. And so the present global, I came across the concept, which we don't talk about in this country, of global anarchy, that's what we have, because anarchy just means the absence of a government. And you can imagine if we didn't have a central government in this country, so that we just had these independent states, and of course that's the way the country started out, we would be having battles between, say, California and Colorado and Arizona over water.
Right, certainly.
California would have its own army. You would have to have your own army to protect yourself. And so we can see the advantage of having a federal system where you can take these disputes to a higher authority, an impartial authority, rather than having highly partial. So that's the way I came into it, as a way to end the nuclear problem and then the more general ending war. Mm-hmm. Because I realized you couldn't get rid of nuclear weapons apart from getting rid of war, because nobody would be willing to give them up.
Right.
And then the more I got into it, I realized, well, if you're going to end war, you've got to have a solution to global inequities. We've got global apartheid now, right. An enormous gap between the rich and the poor countries, and this is growing. It's not getting better. And so the idea of a global democracy is the idea that there would be an authority at the global level above the states, so that issues of a global scope would be assigned to this authority, and only issues of this scope, so that in terms of your question of the ideal structure, it's the concept of subsidiarity, that you handle problems at the lowest level possible. So local problems within Denver should be dealt with by the city government. But statewide problems are obviously the province of the state. But there are certain problems that the state can't deal with apart from other states doing something comparable. You can't fight American pollution. You can't fight global pollution. We need an authority that can regulate matters of global scope. So we're just talking about a few matters: disputes between countries, the global environment, and then the global distribution of wealth, which is now so unequal. It would be the responsibility of this global authority to start and in a with all deliberate speed. That means it couldn't be terribly fast, but people would know that we're working towards a system of greater justice in the world. So
that
that's
gets
the
back
basic,
to the kind of the concept of anarchy. Right now, it's kind of this fascist corporate control that seem to be wielding power on a global scale right now, and there's no overarching government.
That's right. So now with anarchy, the strongest win.
Right.
And so what we have is simply the rule of the richest and the strongest. And so over the last decades, the United States has been basically calling the shots on all issues.
Certainly have.
Now, as our economy is going down and other economies are becoming relatively stronger, we don't have that economic clout that we had at the end of World War II and for several decades afterwards. So now our country is relying on the one tool that we have that's where we outstrip everyone, which is our military strength. So we can we can get our way by either actually going to war to people or with people or just threatening to go to war.
Right.
And so there's a lot more coercion going on than people are aware of, because a lot of it is just you do this or else.
Right. Great.
And so this is no way to run a world.
No, that's quite the picture. Yeah, and definitely can kind of see how there's only a few issues that are going to be regulated globally. And
yeah, so it wouldn't mean getting rid of national government. It wouldn't be getting rid of state governments. It's just you would be adding one more layer that would deal with these issues that countries cannot deal with.
Yeah, that's great to be able to hear you clarify on that point. So who are some of these organizations or leading proponents, on the world stage right now that are kind of envisioning that world, do you see?
Well, it went much out of favor. There was a lot of attention to it in earlier decades, and there was actually a great movement in this country to favor a ballot, put it on the ballot and have people vote. Are we in favor of moving in this direction? But when you look at the history of the last 2 centuries, roughly, and people have been talking about this since the 17th, certainly the 18th century, the need for some sort of higher authority to put an end to war. And each time they would say, yes, we've got to do it, but then when they got down to signing, they would not relinquish their own sovereignty, meaning their right to go to war whenever they wanted to. And so then when we had World War I, people said, okay, now we have to do it. The League of Nations was clearly too weak. It didn't have teeth. Now we're going to create something with teeth. Well, we did sort of. We created the United Nations with the Security Council, which has the authority and the power to stop conflicts, except that 5 countries have veto power, and that means 5 of the most powerful countries.
Rule for everybody else.
Including, so it was us and the Soviet Union, basically, and England, and then we brought in France and China for political reasons at the time. And so these 5 countries can do anything they want to. So, for example, the way this worked was when the Dutch wanted to take over Indonesia again after World War II and recolonize it, we stopped them. And the United Nations stopped them. And they couldn't do anything about it. And so that war didn't happen. But in Vietnam, the French wanted to take it over. They had veto power, and so they went in and tried to do it. And then when they failed, we went in. And so we had this horrible war that killed millions of people, did enormous ecological destruction, and it's just because of this completely immoral system where 5 countries have the right to go to war whenever they want to.
Yeah, certainly. Okay, great.
So one way to put global government would be simply to reform the United Nations. So you wouldn't even have to be creating a new structure. Now, for a lot of people, that wouldn't be the way to do it because there have been a lot of problems in the United Nations, a lot of corruption and a lot of
agendas, everything else that have been popping up over the years.
But still, what it would mean would be giving the General Assembly legislative power. So it means you would have a global legislature that could pass laws of global scope, and so that the people of the world could finally take control of the planet as a whole, because we would all have our representatives, and they could pass laws. You would have a global executive who was empowered to enforce the laws. You would have a global court, a world court, that would have mandatory jurisdiction to interpret and enforce the laws. And then the big crucial difference between that and what we call democracy in the countries is you would take absolute measures to rule out all influence of money, because many people now say democracy doesn't work. Well, democracy doesn't work because it's not democracy, it's plutocracy. Mm-hmm. It's the rule of the rich,
right,
by the rich, for the rich, of the rich. And instead of one person, one vote, we have $1, one vote. So one corporation can outvote the rest of us. Mm-hmm. And if you rule out the influence of money, rigorously rule it out, and that's one thing we can say we've learned from the American experiment, that's the one thing the founders did not do. They did not rule out the influence of money, because they were the rich. They wanted the country to be ruled by the rich. Mm-hmm. They were good, moral rich people for the most part and had the general good in mind, but now we've got, of course, rich people that have no interest in the general good.
One of my questions also.
Yeah.
Just to keep marching forward here. And you kind of touched on this, and I kind of want you to elaborate on it a little further. And it says, essentially, an argument can be made that a democratic process in our own country has been usurped, and candidates are selected rather than elected based on their adherence to corporate and globalist agendas and not the will of the people. If this is the case on a nation-state level, won't it be much that easier to usurp under centralized control of global government?
That's right, if you don't take very stringent means. So within the United States, the very first step we have to take in order to have any meaningful reform at all is campaign finance reform, which means that you take all the money out, you have publicly financed elections, so that our representatives are actually representing the people and pay attention to what the majority of the people in their state want, not what the majority of the rich corporations in their state or in the world want. And so, that just has to be absolutely vital. And this is not impossible. People say, well, you can't rule out the influence of money. Yes, you can. There are very easy ways to do it. And one thing would be, if you want to run for office, you say, I'm honest. I don't mind if someone is looking over my shoulder and making sure I'm not taking bribes, because I'm not going to be taking bribes. In fact, I want somebody investigating me so they can say to the rest of the people, mm-hmm, I am not taking bribes. So there are ways to do this.
Interesting. Great. Well, the Second Amendment in the Constitution assures us the means to overthrow a government once it is unavoidably becoming corrupt and tyrannical. In a global government situation, is this right even more important or less important?
Sure. It's an issue. But when you ask about the practicality of it, do we have the right to overthrow our government? Mm-hmm. technically, yes, but a right without any power is meaningless. We don't have the right to overthrow our government. And so when we're at the global level, you know, there are clearly going to be risks. There's no risk-free form of government. There are no risk-free solutions.
Right, absolutely.
And this is a tendency we have. We think better the devil we have than the devil we don't know. Well, not necessarily, because the devil we have now is monstrous and is leading us to self-destruction. If we do not solve the ecological crisis very quickly, we are not going to have civilization probably more than this century. I mean, there are scenarios of the probability of runaway global warming. And once it's runaway global warming, which means you have positive feedback where A contributes to B and B contributes back to A, there's no stopping it. If we don't stop this very quickly, we're not going to have a civilization. And as I say, what we have now is a structure that promotes war and imperialism. It's a structure that promotes global apartheid. You cannot imagine, really, a structure worse than what we have now. And so to worry about the dangers of moving to a global authority, sure, you should worry about them in advance and say, let's take all possible means to make it as foolproof as possible, knowing there's no 100% guarantee.
Right.
But certainly we will increase our chances of not only surviving but thriving if we would move to a global democracy where the people of the world could take control and rule their own planet.
Yeah. So it seems to me it's more of a safety valve that was written into the Constitution. Obviously, there the patriots and the founding fathers of our own country. They saw the tyrannical government of the British government not worth living under at some point, and so they took the necessary steps to overthrow that. And part of that was the fact that they had the guns and they had the means to do so. If we didn't have the means, do you see maybe some of these organizations possibly taking away that means, or because it's a safety valve in a sense.
But there are no means now. In those days, the difference between the power of a civilian militia and the power of the central government was not a difference of kind. Now, today, when you're talking about nuclear weapons, when you're talking about all the planes and the tanks and all that the Pentagon has, the fact that we've got the right to possess firearms is trivial. So that part of the Constitution is rendered ineffective by the advance of military technology. So the other most important thing, from my perspective, to guaranteeing, or coming as close as we could to guaranteeing that the global democracy wouldn't degenerate into a global dictatorship, would be to, besides keeping the money out, would be to spread the armed forces around the world so they're not centered in any particular part where some rogue faction could get control of a majority of the... First of all, it would mean getting rid of what we now think as military equipment, because we would no longer have armies to fight wars. We would simply have police forces to take care of policing the civilians. So you wouldn't have, and this would get back to my original goal, getting rid of nuclear weapons. There'd be no reason to have nuclear weapons. Now, as we now know, you can't undo the knowledge of how to create nuclear weapons, but you can certainly get rid of all the nuclear weapons and make it so that it would be very difficult to assemble a number of nuclear weapons secretly and quickly in order to do something. Again, of course there would be dangers, but the dangers we have now are so enormous that this would be a risk worth taking.
Interesting. Well, let's keep moving along here. Let's see. All right. We have been pushed into a number of agreements, such as NAFTA, CAFTA, and the SPP, for example. This is, they've been doing this to circumvent the Constitution and congressional oversight leading towards the North American Union. The former chairman of the CFR, David Rockefeller, has even admittedly been guiding policy secretly towards a world government contrary to the nation's sovereignty. And I guess my question is, in this regards, if this push has been done in secret and with disdain for constitutional oversight, how can we be confident that they will install the appropriate Bill of Rights and checks and balances into a form of world government?
Well, when we use this term global government or world government or one world government, there are really two radically, completely different concepts we're talking about.
Right.
The one that scares people and where they get so frightened of the concept, one world government, is this one that would be elitist, a top-down global government. And we have absolutely no guarantee that they would do anything to protect the rights. In fact, we've got pretty good basis for concluding that this would not happen, and this would end up to be a global plutocracy. And so the movement for global democracy, bottom-up global government, is the exact opposite of that, and the thing that you can be sure that they would oppose most strongly. So it's the rich countries and the plutocrats of the world that would be leading the charge against genuine global democracy. That's the exact opposite of what they want. And from my view, this is the only way to stop that, because we are moving willy-nilly towards some kind of integration, because everybody agrees now there needs to be some sort of global governance.
Right. It's interesting that you say that there seems to be two parallel lines of thought as to what global government might look at. Is there anybody you can kind of think of that are more towards the school of thought of about kind of a tyrannical placement, within these bodies of global organizations that we have right now, that are thinking, trying to guide policy that direction, and then are there also some that are kind of guiding policy in the other direction, trying to come from the top, the bottom up, in a sense.
That's not something I've looked into. Of course, a lot of people have written about this and have speculations about what's going on and have various terms for this. I fear that it's going on. I don't know anything concrete that I can talk about. There certainly is within the academic world now a great explosion of interest in global democracy. So I was quite surprised. I'd been working on this, as I said, since 1992. I had a book on global democracy as the solution to war, militarism, the ecological crisis, and a global apartheid, about three-fourths finished. When 9/11 happened, I realized, American imperialism is a theme in all of my chapters, but I don't have a chapter on it where I thematize that as such. So I started writing a chapter on American imperialism. Of course, once you get into it, there's no end to it, so it got longer and longer and longer. So pretty soon I realized, well, this is a separate book. And I had that book about three-fourths written when finally my eyes were opened about 9/11. And so I've never gotten back to those three-fourths finished books. And recently I was approached by a group that was putting out a book on global democracy and asked me for a chapter. And so I did quickly some reading and was just amazed to see how much has happened in the intervening years, where I was one of the few people in 2000 who was working on this, and almost everybody ridiculed it and said, "Oh, sure, we need global governance, but we don't want global government." Now many people are saying, well, you can't have global governance.
That's a distinction, governance and government.
Yeah, see, global governance is a more generic term, and so you can say, well, one kind of global governance would be to have an actual global government, whereas many people were arguing, and some still do, well, no, you could have a kind of global governance without a government, and my argument would be, well, could you even get the garbage collected in Denver without a local government? No, I mean, you can't have governance without an actual government. There'd be nothing to prevent crime and so on. So I was very pleased to see more and more people are now thinking in these terms, and I've got a lot of catch-up work to do to catch up on what has been going on. So you've got a lot of really bright people in the academic world now at least writing about this. So it's almost becoming academically respectable, where it wasn't even just 5 or 6 years ago.
Interesting. All right. Well, the elite and wealthy have been funding the eugenics movements from its conception in the early 1900s, and it continues to be well funded today through the the Rockefeller Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Ford Foundation, Carnegie Institute. The UN even gives out an annual award praising nations such as China for their one-child policy and forced abortions. People who support these population control policies publicly are often proponents of global government. How can we allow such influential people with such little regard for human life determine global government?
Well, we can't, and that's part of my argument. We can't allow the rich of the world to decide policies. Now, the population problem is an extremely serious problem. It's part and parcel of the ecological crisis. So, if we cut back on the emissions from automobiles, for example, say 50%, but in the meantime we increase the global population by 50%, we're still at the same place. So there have to be ways to slow down population growth, but there are humane ways to do this, and again, these should be policies that the peoples of the countries of the world settle through their representatives who actually represent their wishes and not the global plutocracy.
Interesting. Great. Yeah, I thought that was an important one. Let's see. Okay. Here's one, and I probably think I'm a conspiracy theorist.
We're all conspiracy theorists.
It's interesting because it touches on this whole global government, also with the ecological concerns, and respect of 9/11, also false flag terror, and the potential of that. Is it possible for with the advent of technology for a group, an isolated group within the government, to use maybe like man-made ecological disasters, maybe such as famine, or creating tsunamis, or creating who knows, like weather modifications, things of that nature, as technically false flag events to help speed up the process to global governance? Do you see that as being something that we should be wary of coming up? I mean, could they use a false flag terror in that sense in order to speed up the process of global government?
I suspect we're to the point now where these things are technologically possible, and I've read some accounts of particular events that make it seem like at least it's plausible that some of these have occurred already, but I really don't know enough about it to say anything intelligent about it. But certainly it's something, one of the many things that we should be wary of.
Right. Definitely. Great. So legislation has gone in all over the Western world restricting our freedoms. Why do you suppose it has been implemented universally across the globe, irrespective to the fact that if they have had the experience of a large-scale terrorist attack, like Canada or Australia? We've seen the restriction of rights in Australia. We've also seen it in Canada, and they haven't seen terrorism as a threat or anything else like. So why does it seem to be coming about universally? Is it is it policy being set and put into place on a global level that's kind of on the undercurrent?
Well, that's certainly a very interesting question, and a related question is why have we taken such extraordinary steps in response to terrorism, given the fact that in the last 6 years, only a few thousand people have been killed by what one would normally call terrorist attacks. That is, if we include 9/11 in it. When I was in Norway, one of the people at a conference I was at spoke on this and commented on the actually very small number of people. I don't remember the exact figure he came up with, but it's very small compared with, say, the number of people who have died in this country because of staph infections. You would think we would be taking enormous steps to do that. The number of people who've died from murder from firearms, the number of people who've died from automobile accidents, particularly where drinking was involved. And so in terms of the actual number of deaths, terrorism has not yet, but it creates fear. And fear really does work. Mm-hmm. And so governments of the world say, well, look, if we don't take extraordinary measures, and then there is a terrorist attack here, we are going to be blamed for this. So maybe better to be blamed for erring a little bit on the side of reducing rights than being blamed for a huge terrorist attack. And of course they've put forth the scenario of a nuclear attack, which would kill millions and maybe radiate many more millions. And so they've got the means to frighten us and therefore keep us under control. And that's one of the many reasons that I spend so much of my time, virtually all my time, the last 4 years, working on 9/11, because if people would realize that this was a false flag attack engineered by forces within our own government, mm-hmm. and then once that's unraveled and we see how this was done and what the motivations were, that one of the motivations was clearly to be able to pass the Patriot Act. It was clearly already written. This could cause an enormous reaction, mm-hmm. and maybe bring back our sanity. We're really living in an insane period. Our country has really gone insane, and as you say, in a sense, the whole world is going insane with these restrictions. I mean, just the fact that we can't take toothpaste on an airplane anymore. I mean, when I really want to be facetious and people say, why do you work so hard on this? I say, well, mm-hmm. because I'd like to be able to take toothpaste and shampoo on the plane again. I mean, it is just absurd that they get one report that there was one group who allegedly were going to make a bomb out of toothpaste or out of shampoo. And so the whole world has to check all their bags now, causing enormous delays at airports.
Take the shoes off everything.
I mean, this is a rather trivial thing when you think about the larger scope of things, but it illustrates how massive and how foolish the policies that we've adopted in response to this are.
Absolutely. Well, here's one. I'm going to try to get down to the three that I have left here. And the use of secrecy, unjust war, false flag terror, and economic pressure has been used by the elite to consolidate power and centralize wealth for centuries. Do you think that those who have used such tactics and wield tremendous power on the global stage need to first be tried and their power structures dismantled before global government is ever to be attempted?
I wouldn't have anything to say about that. My work is not on the kind of the mechanics and the details of how to do it. It's more the basic concept, mm-hmm. and it would be people who understand a lot more about
you just can't
procedures.
Imagine these people giving up, their grip on power easily.
Yeah. Well, certainly there would have to be means taken to get those people out of positions of power. But what the details of that would be was not something I've thought about.
Right. Okay, and just a couple theology questions for you. Being a doctor of theology and knowing quite well that the Bible has only apocalyptic things to say about humans' attempt to unite the world under global government, how are you able to reason your position respect to such dire warnings?
Yeah, well, the last book of the New Testament is a very interesting book and controversial book, and rightly so, because in one sense it's a horrible book, and my own philosopher Alfred North Whitehead suggested it should have been replaced by Pericles' oration. But I mean, that was a kind of facetious remark, but his point was that that book has engendered a lot of violence in the world, because as human beings we have a religious drive that I call the imitatio Dei, the desire to imitate deity. And if we believe deity, the divine power of the world is one who uses violence to bring about solutions of problems, we're going to have a desire to imitate that. We'll say, well, that's the appropriate way to do it. But there's another way to read that book, and the peace churches have read this way a long time, the Quakers and Mennonites and others, as a purely symbolic work. And they say, look, it's the war of the Lamb, and the Lamb does not use nuclear weapons. In other words, it's a war. It's a war of using peace to solve problems, the method of peace. And if you look at what Jesus was really talking about, as Richard Horsley lays out in his book, Jesus and Empire, when he talked about the reign of God, the kingdom of God, it's the reign of God on earth. It's not an apocalyptic thing. Mm-hmm. And people say, well, yeah, but he thought God was going to bring it in with omnipotent power, and it was going to be all of this. Well, you know, New Testament scholars have shown this is symbolic language, and what Jesus was really talking about was a world in which there would be social and economic justice, where everybody would have adequate food, give us this day our daily bread, and where people would be treated justly and humanely. So all he meant by the rule of God was really a system of governance in which the divine values of truth, beauty, and goodness would rule, rather than the demonic values that they were under the Roman Empire. So he was preaching an anti-imperial gospel, saying what we need, rather than the rule of the emperor, which is demonic, and that's what the symbolism of the last book of the New Testament is saying. It's saying Rome is the beast. Rome is the demonic. And you know, you can understand that in a mythological way, but I've laid out a non-mythological way of understanding demonic power. I did in my book, Christian Faith and the Truth Behind 9/11. You can understand it as simply human rule that is diametrically opposed to the divine values, which now we would add, beyond truth, beauty, and goodness, we would add sustainability and respect for all forms of life. So that's what I'm talking about, that if we bring in a global democracy, we would have at least the chance of approximating the kind of picture of human life on earth that Jesus and the other great religious leaders, you find images like this in all the religions, of a time where justice and peace and goodness would rule, rather than war and the rule of the rich.
Very interesting. Just one last one, and we're going to finish it up here, draw to conclusion. You wrote a chapter in a book entitled Toward Genuine Global Governments, called Global Government Objections Considered.
Yes.
And in it you are quoted as saying, "My major project at present is, in fact, to develop a theology for a new world order." Can you give us an idea of what that theology may look like?
In 2 minutes or less. Yeah, I was working on a book, and another book I had about 3/4 finished was called The Divine Cry of Our World, and I'd taken the notion of the cry from Kazantzakis, and the notion that the divine power is not an immutable, apathetic power, but one that really feels the ills of the world, the suffering of the world, that the great Jewish theologian Abraham Heschel had talked about, and saying that surely if there is such a divine power, that power is crying for the world and is also crying to us, the still small voice, the voice of conscience, mm-hmm. to say you really need to change the way you're living, because this is causing enormous suffering for the majority of the children of God on earth, and also is not sustainable. So this great experiment that I, God, have brought forth, which has taken me billions of years to bring forth an earth that could finally sustain life and then human life. And you're about to screw it up after just 4 centuries of industrial life, since the Industrial Revolution. Really the beginnings of the modern world, which then lead to the Industrial Revolution and where we are now. That unless you wise up, you're going to be destroying my very successful experiment here, hundreds of thousands, millions of years prematurely. So that would be the essence of this theology, to say that this is of extreme importance from a religious point of view.
Right. Great. Well, Doctor, I appreciate your time with us, and I think we'll wrap it up here. And, thank you for coming out to Colorado and giving us the chance to talk with you about some of these issues.
Well, you're welcome, and
was
thank
fun.
you.